Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Good morning and welcome to the 2021 Redistricting Webinar Series presented by the Rural County Representatives of California and the California State Association of Counties. I'm the moderator, Arthur Wyleen, General Counsel of RCRC. This will be the first of two planned webinars addressing the legal requirements and technical aspects of redistricting in 2021. Part 2 is scheduled for April and will be a conversation with county supervisors and staff focusing on best practices and what to expect when you're redistricting. Stay tuned to the barbed wire and the CSAC bulletin for further information. Before I turn this over to our distinguished panelists, a couple of quick housekeeping notes. Our panel has put together an excellent and very thorough presentation, which should take about an hour or so. And we've also left plenty of time for Q&A. We have quite a sizable audience today and will consequently have to moderate the questions. So please use the Zoom Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and type the questions in. I will read them to the panelists during the Q&A period, starting with those that seem to have the broadest audience interest and hopefully getting to everyone's questions. Please don't be shy with the questions. If we don't get enough audience questions, I'll have to make them up on the fly, and really nobody wants to see that. With that, let me introduce our panelists, Christopher Scannell, Marguerite Leone, and Douglas Johnson. Chris and Marguerite are partners with the law firm of Nielsen Merksimer, specializing in elections in general and redistricting in particular. All of those issues that really most of us have only started to pay serious attention to in the last few months, they lived those pretty much throughout the decennial cycle and are here to share their wisdom with us. Doug is a demographer and president of National Demographics Corporation. As I think we all know, at the heart of every redistricting is a complicated math and logic problem that gives us lawyers kind of painful flashbacks to the LSAT. Doug is one of those rare people who is really good at those problems and will help the rest of us understand how to turn the complicated legal rules that you're about to hear into actual maps that actually have real life consequences on the ground. So with that, Chris, Marguerite, Doug, go ahead and take it away, please.
Thanks, Arthur. And welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us today to talk about county redistricting. This is normally a crazy process, a rushed process, a complicated process, but this being 2020 and 2021, it's much crazier this time around. So for those of you who did redistricting 10 years ago in the 2011 cycle, the rules are completely changed, the timeline's completely changed. There's a lot that's up in the air this time around, and so we're going to kind of talk through a bunch of topics, to kind of explain what the process is going to look like this time and how it's different and significantly different than it was 10 years ago. We're going to start off. We're going to talk a little bit about kind of the big elephant in the room right now, developments with the release of the census data and the implications that will have for the process. Spoiler alert. Not good. It's going to be insane. But, a little bit more detail, kind of talk that through. We're going to talk about the new legislation that was enacted last year, AB 849, which changed all the rules regarding the process and all the rules regarding the criteria that you take into account when you draw these lines. And then the amendments that were adopted with AB 1276, sort of some modifications to that. And we're going to talk a little bit, I think, about SB 443, which is currently proposed and which would make some additional changes to the process if it's enacted. And finally, we want to just talk a little bit about the practicalities, the nuts and bolts of how this all works. The things that make the process go more smoothly, the things that don't, the considerations that your registrars have to worry about, and just all of the little details that reading the law isn't going to tell you. And so we're going to kick it off here, I think, with Doug. He's going to start off with the information about the census, and we'll go from there.
Okay. Thank you, Chris. Let me put the slides up here. Okay, so this is what Chris just introduced you to, and as he said, we'll start off with the census. We are in a worst of worst case situations for the Census Bureau. As you may know, the federal law is that redistricting data are supposed to be delivered by March 31st of 2021. And the first announcement was that data would be delayed at least to July 30th. And then we just a couple weeks ago got word that the Census Bureau confirmed the data will be out by September 30th. So we're looking at a delay from what was expected March 31st is now going to be available September 30th. Some people took hope from the phrase that they said by September 30th. So there have been informal communications from the Census Bureau saying, don't get your hopes up. We would love, they're thinking the best case is, September 25th. So it's not going to be more than a couple of days before that in all likelihood. And of course, California being California, we have our own take on things, and we have joined somewhat of a national movement to count prisoners in state prisons at their last known home address, which means that after the census data comes out, the state then needs time to adjust the census numbers to move those prisoners from the state prison location to being counted at their last known home address. The state is currently saying it needs 30 days for that. We're hoping they will work on shortening that time frame, but right now we're looking at census data coming out September 30th, and then the adjusted population data that the new state law says we have to use may not be available till October 30th. So that's a big challenge, and presents huge complications in an already complicated process. And one of the things we'll talk about today is there are new requirements for number of hearings and a lot of other work that can be done before the census data comes out. When we thought it might be July 30th, we were cautious about going forward without the data, but now I think just about everyone's on the same page of, given how short that time frame is, everything we can do ahead of time does need to be done ahead of time. So let me touch a little bit on some of the changes that have happened. First of all, who draws the lines? In virtually every county, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, the Board of Supervisors directly managed the process. And we think most counties will probably do it that way this time around as well. But there is a new law that's now in Elections Code 23001 that does give you the authority, if you choose to do so, to create a commission, either an independent commission, which has to go through some fairly complicated methods for creating it, or just a typical advisory commission, or there's something called a hybrid commission, which is actually an independent commission that draws two maps, and then the board gets to choose one of those two maps. That's pretty rare. We think most that do a commission will go either for an independent or for an advisory commission. One change, there are some counties that 10 years ago or used a commission where some of the supervisors sat on the advisory commission, and that is no longer allowed. If you create an advisory commission, there can't be actual supervisors on it. It has to be separately appointed. So that is one new option facing you, is you do now have the option to create commissions. As many of you know, the state did pass a law saying that Los Angeles and San Diego will use commissions formed by the state. And then Santa Barbara and San Bernardino, the voters voted to create commissions. So those four now will definitely be by commission. And then the rest of you, the board, has the option to create a commission if it chooses to. So as I mentioned, the timing is tough, and with the new laws, we have new deadlines. So we're looking at December 15th as the deadline. That is a little more time than the state law had 10 years ago. So it does extend it from the first day of November, but of course that new time is completely taken away by the census delay. So now we're looking at the population data being available October 30th, and having to finish adoption of the map by December 15th. Again, 6 weeks with Thanksgiving right in the middle of them. It's going to be frantic. And this is where there's SB 594 pending in the legislature. We don't know what shape that's going to take. It did just get one round of amendments that are very small amendments, but we expect there to be more discussion about that bill. So there may be changes in the election timeframe that would let that December 15th date move back. There even is talk of moving the primary, which is obviously a really big deal. in order to allow more time to get through this process. But right now, we're looking at 6 weeks from when the data is released to counties having to finish the process. So as we're dealing with this, we have another twist, which is schedule congestion. 10 years ago, we had the counties and then about 100 cities and school districts and special districts that had to redistrict. It was not that many. Because of the California Voting Rights Act and how that has swept through the state over the last 10 years, that number of local jurisdictions, cities, school districts, and special districts that now hold by-district elections is up to about 500. So we've gone from 150 to 200 to now about 500. In addition, 10 years ago, we had a little bit of a break because we had cities and a few others who had off-cycle elections. They would have their elections in years ending in 1 and 3 and 5 rather than together with the county and state elections. So those jurisdictions actually wouldn't redistrict until after the 2012 election. Now those have been all but eliminated. There's a few holdouts, but the state really passed a law that drove almost everyone into consolidating their elections. So now we have not only 3 times more jurisdictions, but now they're all doing it at the same time. So the one thing if you take nothing out of this, the one thing to take out of this is talk to your county registrar teams, and the registrars prepare for this. We still have a lot of counties that over the course of a decade could manage redrawing precinct lines manually. You know, each time a jurisdiction changed their lines, they would go in and just parcel by parcel reassign everyone. This is going to be a massive increase that comes all at once. And so the registrars really need to have their processes down to automate the process as much as possible and to be able to handle the flood of jurisdictions that are coming in. I will add too, we've talked to some registrars who have done a look at who has by-district elections. Be aware that there are also a lot of jurisdictions making the change right now. So they may not have had by-district elections in 2020, but they will in 2022. And so be aware that there are additional jurisdictions that'll be sending in lines in addition to the ones that you already know about from 2020. So a big workload there. Definitely those registrars need to be preparing for that and getting their GIS precinct mapping teams ready for this flood that's going to come in and threaten to swamp them. So with that, I will hand off to Marguerite to pick up and start talking about the hearings.
Yeah, thank you very much, Doug, and good morning to all of you. At this point, we start getting into the nuts and bolts about how you get this done. And there are changes all along the way. There's an increase in the obligations and requirements for counties. And there are timing requirements that are going to stress that 6 weeks that Doug was talking about, your practical window for getting this done. Now, last time, those of you that were here last time around, you were required to have only 2, actually 1, but only 2 public hearings before you adopted your map. 1 before the public hearing at which you did the adoption. Now you need to have a minimum of 4. One of those has got to be before you draft maps. Now that's the one that Doug is recommending, and we can support that you have before the census data is released. There is data now available that will be used for the redistricting. For example, your ACS data is necessary for Voting Rights Act compliance. And what data we will be using at the end of this year is already available. And the geography, the census geography that you will be using is set and fixed. So at this point, certain analyses can be done of current supervisorial districts and actually areas of your county that can form the basis for a substantial public hearing. It won't just be kind of pie in the sky or unfocused ideas. There will be data to focus on, and that can happen before you have the census data coming out at the end of September. That takes some pressure off your process. But then you have to have 3 more public hearings, 2 of which have to occur after your maps are drawn. Now, there is depending on the timing of receipt of the state adjustments to the census, there is a delay period of either 3 weeks or 1 week or nothing, depending on when that data set is available. You have the earlier it's available, the longer the waiting period before you can draft a map. It is a time period that was drafted into the new law to allow people to digest the census data and understand it before putting lines on a map. But what it is doing now, it is sucking time out of the process that could be used for mapping and map revisions and public input. That has been the 5 months that has been taken up by the Census Bureau without regard to how California decided it wanted to conduct its process. So 2 public hearings at least after maps are drawn, and then you have a floater. The floater can be before maps are drawn, or the floater can be after, but it needs to be on a Saturday, Sunday after hours to increase public participation. So I think there are other details that you need to pay attention to. For example, if you combine the public hearing with your normal supervisorial meeting, then the public hearing has to happen at a date certain. You have to put the time, and it has to happen at that time. You can finish the item before, but then that public hearing has to occur. It can't just flow with the flow of the agenda. Generally, the rule is you can't have the public hearing any earlier than notice. But this rule is you have to have it when noticed, or as close as you can to the notice period. So the whole point of this is to increase public input and to make it convenient for the public to give input. So your hearing obligations are more and more detailed. And then going on to the next slide, there are additional requirements in state law that simply didn't exist before. Your requirement to do public input is now mandatory. And you are required to do it in specific ways and make a good faith effort to get it done. You must use media outreach. You must involve good government, civil rights, civic engagement, and community groups who become your conduit and your access to the public. In other words, it's no longer sufficient to publish your hearing notice in the paper, and those that watch what the Board of Supervisors, the same 10 or 100 people, 100, nice to have 100 people at a meeting, but the same 10 or 20 people that always will come to the redistricting meeting. The law is structured so that that no longer is the case. You must also provide live translation at those hearings with a 72-hour request. You must publish your notices on the internet. And we'll get to this shortly. Your internet requirements are new and specific, but they can be managed if you start right away. Don't wait till the end to set up your internet site for your redistricting. It's going to be much less of a headache and much more complete if you do it from day one. Your notices of these hearings need to be published sooner than required under the Brown Act. Under a Brown Act, 72 hours. It's 5 days here. And it's 7 days, and this isn't on the slide, but it's 7 days for your final map. Oh no, there it is, 7 days for your final map. You must publish relevant demographic data. And this is a challenge because it may not have been standard in some of your counties before. Not only does the public get to comment on the maps you and your consultant or your committee draws, they get to draw maps themselves and submit them for you to consider along with the other maps. So your public outreach is new, it's obligatory, and it is thorough. So Doug, do you want to take over on the next slide?
Yeah, just picking up on that point of the public mapping tools, it's really a new era. We used some public mapping tools 10 years ago, but now there's a ton of them out there. And now we have these new requirements that if anyone sends in a map, you must receive that and keep it as part of the record. I mentioned earlier about the push for commissions. Related to that is going to be a big public push for putting mapping tools out there. Either simple ones that we're seeing the State Commission has put out for their work, and that there are various options for local governments to use too, that simply allow people to easily draw their neighborhood or their community of interest. And that's the kind of stuff that can start now. It doesn't have to wait for the census data for you to go in and just have people draw their neighborhoods and their communities of interest, as we say, that become the building blocks that are then put together into the districts themselves. And then there are also options, paper, Microsoft Excel with paper, or fully online mapping tools now that allow residents to fairly easily develop their own maps, see the demographics of those maps, and make sure that the maps are population balanced and contiguous and those kinds of things. So even obviously for jurisdictions that have commissions, you'll get a lot of interest in residents drawing their maps. And even for jurisdictions where the board maintains control of the process, you'll still expect pressure for these kinds of mapping tools. And one line we often use is, if you put mapping tools out there, you're really making every resident a commissioner. You're not saying just these 5 or 7 advisory board members get to submit maps to the board. You're giving every resident of the county the option to draw and submit a map, which is very empowering, even if you don't have a separate commission.
All right, Doug, I'm gonna jump back into procedural requirements, record keeping requirements, and we'll get back into practicalities in just a minute. But another new obligation is record keeping. Right now, there are, last time around 2011, there was nothing in particular was required. Obviously, if a Public Record Act came along, you dug up what you could, you searched all of your the sources you were required to source, and you produced according to a Public Records Act request. Now you are affirmatively required to keep a record of every public comment and governing body hearing. Needs to be made available within 2 weeks. You have to have a website. You need to maintain that website for 10 years. There are some language requirements within that website, and that pulls in federal requirements under Section 203. And then, of course, being California, its unique requirements with regard to translation. And I would put them out here, except they're different from every county. So you need to look at those on a county by county basis. The Secretary of State's website can be of limited assistance on this, but certainly your elections office should have a handle on the translation requirements for your county. Your web page needs to include specific content. And that's why I say start building it now. And then when the process, and put everything on it. And then when the process is done, just archive it. It saves you a bunch of headaches at the end of the day, trying to collect information that's coming in from multiple sources to staff, to your consultant, and even individually to each one of your supervisors, to the county council. Rather get all of that onto the website and archive it at the end of the day. You've got to maintain that for 10 years. It has to, here's a list on this slide of some of the things that it has to contain. Now, the first item has been prepared for you by the Secretary of State's office, and it exists on the Secretary of State's website. We put the link there for you, but please be careful with that form. It has not worked well for some of our clients, and we've had to make some changes to reflect what is really going on in the county. But the form is to help you, it isn't to corral you. So if you need to make changes on the form, work from the form, and if you need to change a word here and there, go ahead and do that. We have had to do that all along. In addition, your webpage has to contain procedures for testifying, a calendar of all the hearings, the notices, the workshop, so you can see if you keep this up as you go along. Public comments, written summary of every hearing, make sure your minutes are on there, make sure there are minutes or at least a summary of a workshop is on there. Every one of the draft maps need to be there with the data, including those that come in from the public. Somebody could give you a draft map that's drawn on the back of a napkin. You got to digitize that, or you got to take a picture of it and put it online along with the demographics. And then moving on to the next slide, mid-decade, what if you have a significant change within your county that impacts population, maybe a new development with a significant number of housing. It used to be you could make adjustments according to mid-decade estimates of population within your county. You can't do that anymore. You need to have a judicial proceeding to get that done. Then there are qualifications for getting that done. And then moving on to the next slide, what we've done on this slide is taken big chunks of time and put together a pro forma timeline about what has to happen when in order to get the process done. You'll see in item number 4, we're recommending, it's actually item number 3, we're recommending that your pre-map hearings happen in the summer. And then this has the current legal deadline of December 15. That has not been changed in the recent amendments to 594. But the in lieu candidate filing period opens the day after the deadline. So you are likely going to get pressure from your elections office to get that map in final form before the 15th, because the elections office needs to know the supervisorial district boundaries to start that in lieu period. As Doug mentioned, 594 was put in order to develop a system of fixes to the problems caused by the census delay. The first 2 fixes are fairly minor and not as far as they could go to help counties. And those fixes make clear that you don't need to take into account the referendum period. And it also enables counties to act by resolution rather than ordinance in adapting a plan. So it squeezes out the second reading time out of that 6 weeks, but it's still a very short amount of time. So Doug and I kind of went over procedures and hints for you. There's also the substantive law of redistricting that needs to be covered. And for that, Chris, I'm gonna hand off to you for the next slide.
Sure. So as if all of the procedural changes weren't enough, of course, there have been significant changes over the last year in what sort of criteria you have to take into account, substantively speaking, in drawing these lines. Historically, we've given a pitch that the way it works is you have your sort of outer boundaries, which are set by federal law. There's the big three. There's population equality, there's the Federal Voting Rights Act, and then kind of the flip side of that, there's a prohibition on racial gerrymandering. And then within those outer boundaries, state law sort of set the tone. And that's still true, but each of those various pieces have moved and altered over the past 10 years. So I'm going to walk through fairly briefly the federal law changes, because while there have been changes there, they're not as significant as the state law changes, and we want to spend some time on those. But I am going to walk through just sort of how the law has developed at the federal level with respect to those outer considerations. So Doug, if we could move to the first, please. First and foremost, population equality. This is sort of the single most important consideration in drawing district boundaries, and has been for 50 plus years. The state law was amended recently to confirm that it tracks federal law with respect to what's required for population equality purposes. There was always a little ambiguity as to whether that was the case. But the way this works is under federal law is you have to have substantial equality. It's not like congressional districts, which have to be as close to equal as humanly possible. There's a little bit of play in the joints for state and local governments. And the rule of thumb is that if the total deviation of your map is less than 10%, that's presumed to be constitutional. It's not guaranteed. There have been 1 or 2 challenges under 10% that were successful. They were based on the notion that the reasons for the deviation that did exist, and they were close to 10, were improper. But the general rule is 10% is good enough. And the way you do this is you figure out what the ideal population is, and then you figure out how far from that ideal population is the largest district, and how far from that is the least populous district. And if the difference between those two districts is less than 10%, that's the total deviation for the plan that we're looking at. So if we could move on. As a matter of federal law, there have been a few sort of modest refinements here. There's always been a question about whether it was necessary or required to use total population or some other category of population. The Supreme Court did clarify that total population is a permissible way of measuring this, and a jurisdiction that uses that is within constitutional bounds. There's still a question, though, dating back to the 60s, of whether a state that chooses to use something else, for example, registered voters or citizen voting age population or something else, whether that's permissible. In this Burns case, the court did permit the use of registered voters in Hawaii, but it was also based on the premise that the difference wasn't really all that big either way. So there's still a little bit of ambiguity out there as a matter of federal law. It's nice and academic, though, because in California, state law has been amended to clarify that total population is absolutely mandatory. There is no using citizen voting age population. There's no using registered voters in California. The only exception, as Doug has already discussed a little bit, is the adjustment that the state is going to require for incarcerated inmates in state prisons. But other than that, it's going to be the total population from the census. AB 1276 also clarifies that it needs to be based on the last census. So even if you're, in past decades, if you were redrawing lines for some reason in the middle of the decade, for example, the added a large annexation, et cetera, you might use updated estimates from the Department of Finance or something like that. Under state law now, that's not true. You're always going to use the 10 years ago, most recent census data. So if we could go on, Doug. Oh, and so again, with respect to the population, the inmate population, Elections Code 21500A says, you do not count persons in prisons as part of the total population unless you can reassign them back. That only applies to state prisons specifically. For those of you who have federal prisons within your county's boundaries, those prisoners are just going to be excluded from the count altogether because there's no way to reassign them back. The federal government is not going to share records for those inmates that would allow for that, unlike state law. It also doesn't include people in county jails because they're treated as still residing at their last place of residence anyway. It's just the state prison specifically, and we've already talked a little bit about where that stands. We're being told that we're looking at a 30-day period for adjustment. We're still hoping that will be expedited. So within the constraints of equal population, the next big piece is the Federal Voting Rights Act. And the way the Federal Voting Rights Act works, it's meant to prevent any sort of diminution of opportunity for minority voters to elect their preferred candidates. That includes traditional racial minorities and also language minorities as defined by federal law, which is how Latinos and Hispanics based on Spanish language heritage are covered by the law. The rule of thumb here is that if you can't draw a majority minority district, which is defined as 50% plus one, you have no obligations under federal law. The Federal Voting Rights Act does not require any particular configuration of districts. That doesn't mean you can't necessarily take that into account. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but you're not required to, legally speaking. If you can draw 50% plus one, then it gets a little bit more dicey. It's supposed to be an effective majority minority district. There are cases that suggest that if it really is just 50% plus one, then maybe that's not going to be required because it wouldn't be effective. But it gets pretty dicey and it requires some pretty detailed analysis at that point to decide whether that's a district that needs to be drawn or not. We can move on. The way this works primarily in the redistricting context, section 2, is either packing or cracking. And the way packing works is you have a challenge, the minority voters are enough to perhaps have enough population to control 2 districts, but the lines are drawn in such a way that they're so heavily concentrated in one that it deprives them of the ability to have the impact in the second district. And then the flip side is cracking, which is dividing minority communities so that their influence is so dispersed amongst the districts that they're not able to control any. If we can move on, Doug. So all of that, those slides I could have given 10 years ago. The law isn't really all that different in some respects, but what we've seen is a few key changes. First of all, some of you may have been in counties that were 10 years ago were covered by Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. And Section 5 is the rule that required certain jurisdictions, mostly southern states and some other states, and in California, a few counties and the districts that covered them, to submit any voting changes at all to the federal Department of Justice for approval before they could be implemented. And that it covered redistricting plans. It also covered precinct changes. It covered polling place changes, you name it. In 2013, 2012, one of the 4 counties that was covered was able to successfully bail out. And so all of the jurisdictions that were overlapping Merced County got out of that requirement. And then the following year, the US Supreme Court basically put a hold on the application of this law nationwide. There's still a possibility that Congress may try to revive it by changing the formula, because the Supreme Court basically ruled that the formula for deciding which jurisdictions were subject to it was just too out of date to be applied. So in theory, it could be updated, but as of right now, that's not the case. So Section 5 currently doesn't apply to anybody. The other major change we've seen is, we talked about cracking and packing. Historically, Voting Rights Act claims were cracking claims, particularly in California, the division of minority communities. There has been an increase in the last 10 years on changes to more packing claims, claims that there were districts being drawn that have too high a minority percentage, and it's wasting those minority votes. And that relates to the racial gerrymandering piece of it that we'll talk about next. The federal law, because of the Voting Rights Act, requires that jurisdictions take racial considerations into account. You have no choice but to look at that. And the Supreme Court has also said that it's sort of a permissible thing if it's mixed in with all of the other considerations that you normally take into account: compactness, communities of interest, etc. But while you have to take racial considerations into account, the Supreme Court has also said that under the 14th Amendment, you can't do it too much. It's a bit of a tightrope, and it always has been. The way this works is the court has said that if race is the predominant consideration, you subordinate everything else to racial considerations to draw your districts, that is impermissible unless you can show that there's a compelling state interest in doing so. And the only one that they've ever recognized is compliance with Section 2. So if Section 2 requires you to draw that district, or at least you have a good reason and good, based on some evidence to think that it requires you to do that, then you can do it. Otherwise, you have a potential 14th Amendment claim against you. The way that this typically has come up in the past and was identified is you'd get crazy looking districts, look like a bug splattered on a windshield. We've got the sort of traditional example that started all of this back in the early 90s. This is District 12 from North Carolina, which sprawled from Charlotte to Durham. It was like 130 miles, and at some points was as narrow as the freeway. And the court said, well, it's pretty obvious what's going on here. The only possible explanation for this district is race. And so in that case, the state of North Carolina was required to make changes or show that Section 2 required it. But to be clear, it's not necessary that you show a crazy shape like this. If there's other evidence that race was the overwhelming consideration, that's sufficient too, either in the legislative record or other circumstantial evidence. But again, it's not that race can't be considered at all. It just needs to be one of the things in the mix. And so the key is to focus on all the other traditional criteria that we talked about and that we will talk about as a matter of state law. And so on this point, there have been a lot of cases over the last 10 years. This is where most of the change in the federal law has occurred. And I'm not going to walk through the facts of all these cases and all of the holdings. They are all kind of different and all have their complications. But the big rule of thumb, the major lesson to draw from the law as it's developed over the last few years is you need to build a record. It used to be that you could kind of rely on rules of thumb or kind of ballpark estimates. There used to be in federal law sort of an assumption that a district needed to be 65% minority to be effective, and it was based on kind of a 5% for citizenship, 5% for voting registration rates, 5% for voting age population disparities. Those kind of rule of thumbs are dead as far as the Supreme Court is concerned. If there's an effort to draw a majority-minority district, you're going to have to justify it to make sure that you are not running afoul of these gerrymandering requirements. And that may mean, a complicated, racially polarized voting analysis. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court decides these cases in the context of state legislatures that have lots of resources and doesn't really give any sort of thought to how it impacts small jurisdictions with limited budgets. But it may be if you have the possible ability to draw one of these majority-minority districts, you may have to do that sort of racially polarized voting analysis to decide if it's justified, if it's required, if it's not. So building that record is going to be very important this time around. So that's the federal law. As I said, the outer boundaries. I'm gonna turn it over here, I think, to Marguerite. Now we're gonna talk about where the real change has come in the last 10 years, and that's state law.
Thanks, Chris. Chris, I want to just back up to your last slide just to say one thing. Don't think you're getting around the need to build a record by setting a quota for yourself and saying, we're going to do majority minority districts, but we're going to make sure they're all 55% minority eligible voters. That is equally as bad as failing to set them at all. One of these cases here, actually the Beth O'Neill case, the legislature there, Virginia, thought they were doing the right thing by setting the standard. This is going to be our standard, and the Supreme Court struck it down. So re-emphasizing that was considered to be racial gerrymandering, and it was considered to be, you have to have a record. Just restating what Chris said. But now let's move on to slide 22. There's always been state law criteria, but there's been big changes with AB 849. It's what's called the Fair Maps Act. All of that procedural detail that I talked about in the prior slides is in AB 849, is modified by 1276, AB 1276. If you pull it up online now, it's all consolidated. But the new rules apply to only cities and counties. So if you have county-wide special districts or special districts that are under the control of the Board of Supervisors, but they're in director divisions, this law doesn't apply. It applies to the effect that it's considered maybe a best practice, but literally by its terms, AB 849 applies only to cities and counties. You had a lot of discretion before to pick and choose criteria that worked for your county and had been approved by the courts in other contexts, and were just basically good government criteria that worked for your county. Right now, the new law specifies the criteria you must use, and they are mandatory. Before, you had a lot of discretion to weigh and balance and choose criteria out of the statutory list. You might have some of that now, but you must use the mandatory criteria. They are ranked. You have to use them in order of priority. Question whether they're exclusive. Now, the law does not specifically say they are, but if you're going to use a criterion not on the list, it's going to be important to be able to demonstrate that the mandatory prioritized criteria are satisfied before you bring to bear a consideration that's not on that list. There is, I know we're all nonpartisan at the county level, but there is in the law applicable to counties a prohibition on partisan gerrymandering. You cannot draw districts to favor or discriminate against a political party. And these criteria are somewhat familiar insofar as you participated in the statewide redistricting in 2011, because the criteria are not dissimilar. So moving on to the next slide, here's your comprehensive list. Redistricting under AB 849 is modified by AB 1276. Apply your federal criteria, and these are just what Chris gave you a primer on. Then you have to follow on with your state criteria, and here they are in order of priority. You have to have contiguous districts. It's defined in the negative. In other words, you can't have point contiguity. In other words, two districts that just join at a single point. That is not considered contiguous. But the law doesn't say what is contiguous. For example, if you have a district that spans a mountain, but it's geographically contiguous, but nobody really can get around it. Does that satisfy this criterion? Hard to say. You must respect the geographic integrity of established neighborhoods and communities of interest. And how do you find out what those are? Doug's going to address that in the next slides, in the next couple of slides. That's what your public hearings are for. After identifying community of interest, you need to preserve your cities and towns. So if a community interest spans a municipal boundary, the community of interest prevails. These are mandatory and prioritized criteria. You must use easily identified natural and artificial boundaries. In other words, you can't use property lines between parcels where there's no road, nobody really knows where it is. Somebody put a fence and it might be on the property line and it might not. You've got to use easily identified natural and artificial boundaries. And if after all of this is done, you can make your districts compact. Well, you can try to do that too. You're encouraged to do that, but not required to do that. And then number 3, as I mentioned, other criteria could potentially be considered as long as they don't subsume the mandatory prioritized criteria. And one thing that is always of consideration is trying not to disenfranchise voters between election cycles by moving them from one district to another. That could potentially be a legitimate criterion after the other criteria are met. And then lastly, as I mentioned, there is now for counties and cities a prohibition against partisan gerrymandering. And that's the last bullet point here. And then Doug, I'm gonna go to you for the next slide, which starts talking about communities of interest.
Sorry, thank you. And this is a big deal. You know, communities of interest were always something that were an allowable consideration, but now they're put into statute. They're actually defined by statute. And as Marguerite was just saying, they're actually put above cities in terms of consideration in the prioritized criteria. So first of all, we have a definition now. It's here on the screen. You can see it's a population that shares a common social or economic interest, which is kind of the traditional definition, with the added comment of that shall be included within a single district for purposes of its effective and fair representation. So we'll have this challenge now of defining communities of interest slightly different, because the state, of course, when the state commission was working 10 years ago, they referred to communities of interest so often that they actually started talking about COI. They didn't even spell it out. They just referred to COI. And one reporter commented it sounded like they were talking about fish ponds because everyone was talking about COI. But it's all about communities of interest. But this definition does not apply to the state commission. It only applies to cities and counties in terms of that requirement about a community of interest is an area that benefits from being in a single district. We work with some jurisdictions that talk about, you know, we have a lot of cities in particular along the coast that say, you know, well, the coast and the erosion issues on the coast are a citywide concern, so every district should touch the coast. And essentially the coast would be a community of interest for the state, but it's an area that they've determined does not benefit from being in a single district, so would not be a community of interest under this law for counties and cities. So defining this is going to be tricky. As Margaret and Chris talked about earlier, this only applies to cities and counties. So school districts, the state, special districts are all working under the federal discussion of communities of interest, which is different. And this is where you'll have a combination of data and in particular public input to help you through this process. So we ask all our clients, do you have identified neighborhoods? Mostly this is a city thing, but the city identified neighborhoods could very well apply to the county redistricting as well. Because if you're a defined neighborhood,
Doug, we seem to have lost your audio. Are you still there?
I think we may have lost him.
I think we lost the connection completely.
So I'll just pick it up. Doug, he was starting to talk about a little bit about sort of defined neighborhoods and planning areas. Those they're useful because there's something that, quite apart from redistricting, the city or the county has already identified as having a common interest and having a common usage. And so it's a good starting point. And then you can sort of elaborate that with census data that help define communities, as well as probably most importantly, public input. The federal law has always recognized that really communities of interest are what the local population says that it is. And so, this is where your pre-map public hearings really start to come in. You really want to have the public come in and tell you, what is your community of interest? And it could be just about anything. It's such an open-ended sort of possibility that there are any number of different ways that it could be defined. Lifestyle, economic, demography, but it's going to be jurisdiction specific in a lot of cases. And so you want to have the public come in and tell you what that looks like. We also should mention, and this relates to a point that Marguerite made a little bit earlier, related to the politics. The law doesn't specifically say that incumbents shall not be considered in this process, but it does say that communities of interest cannot be defined with respect to political parties, incumbents, or political candidates. This is something that is a little bit tough in some cases because, particularly in a small county, everybody knows where everybody lives. So you may not be able to, definitively show that people didn't take that into consideration, but it's at least important going in not to have that be part of your record, not to, don't have a database with that stuff in the mix. It's people may know, but you have to make at least a good faith effort not to have that be part of the consideration.
And if I could make 2 points here, Chris, you got to remember that your communities of interest can't be amorphous. They have to be mapped. We're in a mapping process. So in order to consider a community of interest, you need to know where it is. So we're not talking about, something that spreads over the whole county and is a common interest. It has to be mappable, number one. And number two, as Chris said, your public hearing. Number three, this sort of stuff you can get in there now and start developing that at this time. And Chris, you want to grab the last slide too?
Yeah, just real briefly here. I mentioned sort of the diversity of what could be considered a community of interest. These are some examples. I'm not going to walk through all of them, but for those of you who are going back and looking at the slides later, some examples of what the testimony supported in 2011 before the State Commission. One example that Doug often uses that I've always liked is the people in downtown Phoenix who owned sort of historic brick homes would come in and say, look, we feel like we have a common interest in how these homes are treated and we want to be in the same district. And the city council put them in the same district. So, I mean, it's a pretty open-ended thing. If people will come in and talk about it and explain what their community of interest is, there aren't a whole lot of limits as to what kinds of things it could be, except as Marguerite mentioned, it does need to be mappable. And so, in the past, a lot of times public testimony would be very generic. And when it was talking about communities of interest, it would kind of very vague and not really actionable in any way. What we what is important to do this time around is to actually get people to talk about where that community is, right? It's from, First Street to Fifth Street and Main Street to State. So you actually know what it is and where it is, and you can actually concretely define that area so that you can take it into consideration. And so it's going to be important this time around to have mechanisms that allow you to fulfill that. And one possible way to do it, this is an example, again, from a few years ago, or 10 years ago, the State Commission, there were questionnaires, what is your community, what are the boundaries, and why should it be kept together? Having this type of concrete information is going to be important this time around to comply with the state law requirements.
And remember, once you get your demographer on board, this can be imported into your database, as can planning documents of the cities and other special districts and towns of the area. They can be imported into your database. So when you start drawing lines, it's already there. You don't draw lines and then adjust them. You draw your lines and you look at everything, those neighborhoods and those communities of interest that have been geographically defined, and you pull them into your database before you start drawing your lines. Doug, are you back with us?
I am back. My apologies. I actually have never had that happen. I had to completely reboot my computer. But I'm back, and thank you, Chris, for picking up.
Yeah. So we were just talking communities of interest. I skipped this slide, but if you want to go ahead, you're welcome to.
Sure. Just briefly, as we're wrapping up on the last couple of slides here, this shows something that used to be acceptable 10 years ago and is no longer acceptable, which is some jurisdictions used to say, let's try to keep kind of an at-large feel to our elected body, even when we have to go to district elections. And this relates back to the idea of an area that actually benefits from multiple seats as well. So you can see on the left, this is the city council districts in South Pasadena. Obviously funny looking, but funny looking for a policy reason, which is they wanted all the council members to still feel like they had accountability and an interest in each part of the city. And so the lines intentionally tried to blend neighborhoods. Same thing on the right. That's the city of Pasadena's city council districts. The line where they all come together is Colorado Boulevard, famous for the Rose Parade, and now famous for Old Town Pasadena, one of the most successful redevelopment projects, I think, in the state's history. And the whole goal when they drew these lines was that the whole council feel accountable and responsible for that Old Town development and that downtown part of Pasadena. And it's worked. They've actually redrawn the map, after each census twice since they originally took that approach, and they've kept it because they felt it was working. Again, these are what traditionally would have been considered communities of interest being divided, so they have multiple representatives. And the new law now says if you define something as a community of interest, it has to be kept intact. So you have to be careful about what gets defined as a community of interest or a neighborhood.
Now, the one, I just chime in, the one slight nuance here is that, and the way you may still be able, in some respects, to do something like this is that you're going to have a bunch of communities of interest, right? Not all of them are going to be able to be unified. Something's going to have to give almost inevitably. That's just the nature of redistricting. And so the council may still have some, or your boards may still have a bit of discretion here in saying, look, we've got 16 communities of interest. One's got to get split. This is the one that makes sense. And doing something more similar to this. So there's still some discretion. There's still some level of judgment and decision making, even within the new constraints of state law.
Yep.
And
yeah,
then one other little nuance here is your definition of community of interest is based on benefit in a district. And Doug and I had this experience last time around in Arizona. We were redistricting, we were working with the city in Arizona, and there was a group that was particularly large and particularly politically active. And by any definition, they would have been a community of interest. But that group was large enough to be a significant block in, what was it, 2 or 3 districts, Doug?
3, yeah, 3.
And every single meeting, they came into the council and said, divide us up. So under the new state definition of community of interest, is that really a community of interest? In that its view, it didn't feel it would benefit from being united in a district. It would benefit from being divided. So this is going to be a brand new area for boards and commissions to navigate.
Mhm, definitely.
All right. So again, another drink from the water hose, just to kind of briefly sum up all of the changes in state law. It's been a lot. As we said, other than the sort of the outer federal boundaries, it used to be that the criteria were permissive, that they were discretionary, that the boards and councils had a ton of ability to weigh and balance, what made sense for the jurisdiction. Not true as much anymore. Now the criteria are mandatory, as we've said. They are ranked in order of priority. There's still, again, maybe some areas in which discretion is exercised, but it's far, far less than it was 10 years ago. It's not clear, as we discussed, to what extent non-statutory criteria can be considered. Again, the best view we have, and talked to some of the folks who drafted these laws, and they seem to agree, is that yes, you might be able to take those things into account as long as you're not doing anything to violate those mandatory criteria. But the law is not explicit on that. So there's a little bit of potential risk there. And consideration of incumbency in political parties now restricted. Political parties really probably just shouldn't be considered at all. Incumbency, subject to the same rules as any non-statutory criterion. We talked about the exclusion of the prisoners. It used to be that you had the option to either exclude them or not. A lot of counties did, some didn't. Now the state has taken that discretion away. Now you have to exclude them. And then, there's new legislation, AB 443, pending in the legislature, that would change the rules again and model them on the California Commission. A lot of those changes are really directed at school districts and special districts, which are not subject to all of these changes. But it does have some adjustments to the criteria again. For example, the total population factor. When the Fair Maps Act was adopted last year, it was explicitly drafted and worded in a way to make clear that state law tracked federal law. The substantial equality, that was intentional and purposeful. Now the AB 443 would change it and basically make, move it more toward like the congressional requirement, which is it has to be as close to equal population as you can make it. And there are some other sort of similar changes. Whether this law is going to pass is anybody's guess. It's August deadline for legislation to pass. By then, we'll be way down the road on this stuff. And the way it's drafted, it may even require redistricting again in 2022. But we're keeping our eyes on that.
And then I wanted to just mention one other thing before we close. I was on one of my slides and I want to make sure that I say it. The deadline is December 15. If you don't make the deadline as a county, you lose jurisdiction. It's not a, no harm, no foul. So you do the 17th of December instead of the 15th. The law explicitly takes jurisdiction away from you and gives it to a court to draw your lines. You have to pay for the court's process, but you lose jurisdiction. So pay attention to your deadline.
All right. So with that, Arthur, I think, has been collecting questions and we're happy to answer them.
Okay, thank you very much. We definitely have gotten a really good raft of questions here, which I will try to pitch to you and stump our expert panelists. I will say first that the single most popular question that we got was whether the PowerPoint would be made available to attendees. The answer to that is yes. I will be working with the tech folks at both RCRC and CSAC to figure out how we're going to do that, whether it will be emailed out or put on the website, and if which website. But we will communicate with the folks that are on here regarding how you can get that, because we have gotten a lot of requests. So moving on into the substantive questions, I'm going to try to group these in a way to kind of make sense. There were a number of questions about process and then some about substance. So let me ask some of the process questions first. The first one is, for previous redistrictings, our county asked each of the supervisors to suggest a person who would act in an advisory capacity only, with the board members making all decisions and also considering all public comment at the public meetings and work sessions. The advisory committee did not meet in accordance with the Brown Act. Of course, all hearings and meetings were. Is this process still allowed under the new rules?
Yes. It is an advisory panel under the new law. It's the Brown Act nuances need to be decided based on the formation of that group, right? And also the specifications of the county. But advisory commissions and just advisory individuals are still permissible.
So I think if I'll ask maybe a follow-up question from kind of how I took this, to what extent are there restrictions or are there no restrictions on kind of informal advisory processes that maybe don't meet the criteria for an advisory commission, but are, nonetheless helpful to the board? Are there restrictions there, or is that still kind of open as long as you don't transgress anything explicit?
That's still open. For example, a board may want a representative from each of the major cities or towns in the county and to assist in developing, understanding the criteria, and there's informal advisors are not prohibited.
Yeah.
Okay.
I would add just a little bit to that, though, just to circle back on the point Marguerite made earlier, but you really need to make your record. So there needs to be a clear record of how the map was driven by the criteria and how each of those criteria were addressed. It can't be kind of a map just appears and gets adopted, as sometimes has been done in the past. So it is, as I said, legal. All those folks can have input in the process, but especially now that we have these listed criteria, you need to be sure you make a record of how the map addresses those listed criteria.
And Doug, I need to thank you for that, because while these public hearing requirements are new and somewhat onerous, they have the benefit of developing a clear record. And the more information you have in the record, the more discretion you have as the redistricting authority to pick and choose. So while private advisors may be helpful, if they are not on the public records, it's as if they did not exist.
Thank you. That is very helpful indeed. So we've got a couple of related questions here, both with regard to kind of what the legislature might do. The first was, is there any possibility or is there any discussion of the legislature postponing the June primary, which would in turn obviously affect the redistricting deadlines? And the related question was, is there any possibility of the legislature essentially changing the law to allow for counties and presumably other agencies to postpone their redistricting until after the 2022 primary? And I will say, I'll defer to the panel on the question of whether that's permissible. I will say I'm not sure there's a lot of appetite for either of those in Sacramento, but I'll certainly defer to our panelists on those questions.
Yeah, I mean, I would second that. You say, is there discussion? Yeah, there has been some discussion of postponing the primary. I'm not sure at the legislative level there's been a lot of that. And I'm not sure there's going to be a lot of stomach for it from the perspective of elections officials, right? Because you have June to November now to certify your primary results, do any litigation that you have to do, post recounts, et cetera, and get everything ready for November. Keeping in mind that you have requirements to get your overseas ballots out months in advance of the election and all of the various steps that you have to go through. I don't know this for sure, but my suspicion is that county registrars are going to object to being crunched by having the primary pushed significantly back. And I don't know that there's been a whole lot of movement in that direction at the legislative level. As for the other piece of it, whether the legislature could postpone the whole thing, there are cases that say that if you had, they're district court cases, so, not Supreme Court, but there have been cases that say if you have even year elections and you don't redistrict, by your first even year election after the census, that you're violating the equal population requirements. There's a little bit of wiggle room for odd year, because of the compressed timeline. It's anybody's guess what the courts would do given the sort of exigent circumstances here and the unusual restrictions. Maybe they would take that into account and allow it sort of on a one-off basis, but who knows? And again, I don't know that there's been any discussion of doing that at the legislative level.
A third option is surely not, is a kind of an intermediary option, which is to shove some of the filing deadlines. But that's also going to be a heavy lift, and it's going to be something of concern for the elections officials. But that it has also been discussed. We just don't know where the Glazer bill is going to go with easing up the burden on counties especially.
Okay, thank you. So here's one I know that we had actually talked about a little bit in some of our prep meetings. Can the redistricting hearings be remote meetings, or must attendees be allowed to attend in person?
There are no specific requirements one way or the other. It's subject to the normal rules of any other public meeting. And so, obviously right now, most public jurisdictions are doing primarily virtual meetings. And as long as we have health orders in place that are sort of driving that direction, there's no reason to think that that's going to change. I think in an ideal world, it would be good to have the option for live participation for people, because not everybody can participate virtually or prefers to. But for right now, there's no special rule for redistricting hearings, compared to any other type of public meeting or hearing that's being conducted.
And I would add to that too, there actually is a bill. One of the things that's happened is we've had a lot of jurisdictions go through this process entirely virtually because they've gone through it in the COVID era. And there is some silver lining. Obviously, there are problems with that for folks who don't have access, but there's some silver lining of people who, have kids or otherwise couldn't make it to the meeting, actually are better able to participate. So there is a bill now. We'll see if it goes anywhere. It would actually say all jurisdictions must offer a virtual option, even when they're having in-person meetings. So right now, Chris said it's clear, but folks should be aware that that may be coming down the line, because we do get a number of people, for example, parents, who it's a lot easier for them to have their kid eating dinner next to them while they Zoom into the meeting than it is to try to arrange daycare and those kinds of issues.
So kind of related to that, we've gotten a question about define live translation and talk a little bit about what that looks like, because that's obviously new for a lot of us.
Yeah, well, on the virtual side, it actually works great. Zoom, at least for those using Zoom and other platforms that have the process, if you're in a Zoom session, down at the bottom, just down where it says chat and Q&A and all that, there's another button that says choose your language, and you have a live translator who's set up, and when you click on that, the audio is the live translator's voice on that other language. And Zoom, I think, can handle up to 4 or 5 different language channels, but it does involve having a person. I think there's some provisions for text translation, closed caption kind of translation, but the preference is definitely to have a person providing live translation of the meeting It can be simultaneous, which obviously makes the meeting much more procedurally smooth, but you could alternate back and forth. We have traditionally done hearings where we'll talk, then we'll pause, and the translator will translate and back and forth, but that makes your meetings really long. Especially, and that's really hard to do when you get more than one other language too. The other approach that sometimes is done is kind of have people group around the room in language groups. That's it gets the job done, but it's really hard to pull off effectively.
So our next question concerns redistricting commission. The requester's county is set to appoint a redistricting commission in the next couple of months. What would you recommend the commission do as we wait for the census data?
Marguerite, do you want to do that one since you're doing San Diego?
What does the commission do? Well, it depends on the type of commission. If it's an independent commission or a hybrid commission, it needs to figure out where it's going to get the technical expertise to do the job, number one. So make sure you have your consultants on board. Surely you're going to need and these could be county resources. You're going to need GIS. You're going to need public outreach, because those are obligations that are now in the law. Number two, as I mentioned, once your consultant's on board, it is possible to start your public hearings now. And that includes generally a hearing in each one of the supervisorial districts. That's more than is required, except for Los Angeles and San Diego. Start your public hearings now and get the public familiar with some of the data that is going to be applicable to the final plans. Thirdly, get your communities of interest mapped. What are the neighborhoods? What are the planning areas? What are the identified communities of interest? And identify them. Don't have them kind of floating in and out of the record. Settle on what they are, so when you start to map, there's an agreement about the communities of interest that should be in the same district. Get those mapped and off and going. And in order to do that, you can start having the public submit maps of their communities of interest. Next, you can have the public comment on how the current districts worked or how they didn't, and get that on board so you have an idea, without regard to population, what changes would be helpful to the public's interaction with its board of supervisors. And I'm going to say this, and Doug can come in and tell me that I'm crazy, but I think that it is possible to start mapping as soon as that census data is available, and then make adjustments once the adjusted data comes out. So your commission at least has contours of districts that it can work with, and then refine those districts when the adjusted data comes out. Doug, what's your view of that?
Yeah, I think it's a technical challenge, but it's certainly possible. And actually, we're pretty close to being comfortable actually saying we'll put out some American Community Survey based data, with some validation and some flags to it, where we might even let residents start drawing maps using estimated population data, over the summer. So you wouldn't do this for official draft maps. You wouldn't want your consultants or your commission to put out any maps using that kind of data. But at least your residents could start working on their maps. And then when the data hits, they would only have to fine tune them, adjust them where the census data came in, different than was anticipated. So yes, I think certainly without a doubt, residents can start mapping the communities of interest and submitting those. And there are various options for starting to put in maps that are, at least the residents can start talking about what makes sense and sort of addressing their compromises they'll need to make so that different community groups can agree on a map that they then propose to the commission. So yeah, there's certainly a lot that can be done even before the Bureau releases its data. And then you're right, there'll be a short window where we may be able to do some work. Hopefully the state will kind of get its act together and there won't be that 30-day break between the official data and the state data, but there is some window certainly for being active in there as well.
And then Art, I want to reiterate my comment. You need that website, and that can start being structured and populated now. So your commission will set up its website, and everything the commission does, hears, emails, maps, community of interest, hearings, summaries, hearing, all gets put on there. Your commission can do that. So when your map eventually goes to the Board of Supervisors, all of that aspect is taken care of, archived at the end of the day.
Let me ask, I got another question kind of sort of in the similar vein with regard to public process. Does the public workshop held under Elections Code 21507.1 have to be held in compliance with the Brown Act? That's the provision that says the board may have county staff or a consultant conduct one or more public workshops in lieu of one of the public hearings required under paragraph 1.
It does need to be noticed, right, as a hearing.
Yeah, it does need to be noticed. Now, I think there are several nuances to that question. If the board is going to attend the public hearing, it's always safer to notice it as a meeting, a special meeting, because then the board can participate. They can talk among themselves, they can ask questions, etc. If the board isn't there, there certainly has to be a notice that's required. But other Brown Act requirements applicable to a meeting of a public body, if it's just conducted by staff, probably not.
I think this is one that if I were to get such a question from one of our members, I would probably say, well, if the governing body, if the legislative body is not present, then no, it's not subject to the Brown Act. However, why take chances? It's relatively simple to do Brown Act-like things like having what would be a compliant agenda, having your document, your materials available early. This might be one of those things that it's better not to take chances because it's relatively simple to comply, but relatively complicated to be accused of non-compliance.
Art, I like that.
So we've gotten a number of questions about asking for some clarification on the December 15th deadline. You know, what that means both for counties and also what that means for other entities that need to do redistricting, cities, districts, etc. Could you elaborate a little bit more on what the December 15th deadline means and who it applies to?
Yeah. So it means that you have to have a final vote to adopt a map by December 15th. Now, and all counties are going to be subject to that deadline. Cities are only going to be subject to it if they have their election at the June primary. So all of your cities that have November 2022 elections, they have a later deadline, which is going to be a relief to them and to everyone else doing this. School districts and special districts have different deadlines. School districts are March 1st of 2022, and special districts are 180 days before their election. There are a few special districts that have their own unique deadlines in the codes, but the general rule of thumb is 180 days. So it's really primarily counties that December 15th deadline is going to apply to, and a handful of cities. And I said, what you need to do is you need to have a vote and adopt the map. And that's true. There's a little bit of, it comes with a few caveats though. Obviously, there's the issue of a referendum. If you wait until the 15th and adopt on December 15th and somebody, heaven forbid, does a referendum, all bets are off as to how that works, right? Is a court going to allow that map to still be used? Is a court going to block it? Your old map may not still be constitutional. So, historically, we would have recommended finishing by November 15th. Obviously, that's not going to be feasible this time, but that is a quirk that maybe the legislature will address. The other is that county registrars, at least in some counties, are saying, we don't care what your legal deadline is. We need those lines sooner as a practical matter, because they have to take them and get them in the system and reassign all of the voters so that candidates and voters know what district they're in, because as Marguerite said, the candidate in lieu filing period opens December 16th. So it's the legal deadline, but may not be the practical one in some cases.
And it's worth noting, we have a couple of counties that historically have said, the registrar's office has said, there's a statute that says precincts can't be changed from the primary to the general. So they've said everyone needs to have their maps done in time for the primary. There's a giant loophole that 55 or 56 counties drive through, which is you can subdivide precincts after the primary. So jurisdictions, move to district elections too late for that all the time. So it's something for registrars to be aware of, given these timelines. Those that historically asked the cities and schools and everyone to finish in time for the primary, even if they didn't have primary elections, it's just not going to be possible this time. So those registrars need to be ready for that eventuality.
So that's
the deadline for the deadline for cities, I think, is the 17th of April if they have a November election, just to put that date out there. But for county, and for special districts, there are some that in their operative act have November 1st of 2021. That's impossible to meet now. It's just impossible. That's got to be fixed. And it's not fixed in the current version of the Glazer bill. So we're cognizant of that. There's 180 days before the election for some, but some have a fixed deadline of November 1. But we can't emphasize enough, you have a December 15 deadline in statute. You got to be talking to your elections office. What do they need to import the map and get ready to open the filing period?
So I think you may have already answered this, but one question we got that I think would be good to clarify on the record. Does the December 15th deadline only apply to the vote on the final map, or does the ordinance actually have to be adopted and go into effect, which, as I'm sure is typically a 30-day waiting period?
And so that is the one change that the current version of SB 594 would clarify, is that it's just got to be the vote. Right, the board has to vote, and the effective date being 30 days off doesn't affect that. It's probably still too modest to change, in some respects, but at least that is the one issue that the law as drafted is meant to address and to clarify. So it's not you have to vote by November 15th so it can take effect by December 15th.
And the current law, if just mentioning, isn't clear on that question, but as we talked, I think as Marguerite talked about earlier, if you do get a referendum and it does qualify, you're going to be after the deadline and to finish, and so a court's going to get involved by statute of taking over the map drawing. So that court could then address the filing deadlines and those kinds of issues that would come out of being late if you did get a referendum.
So sort of related question. If I'm reading this correctly, is there any change regarding the requirement to not make signatures in lieu available until 28 days after adoption of the map? We may finish by December 15th, but this would mean the in lieu period would be delayed a month, ?
There's no change to that in the current version of the Glazer bill. So if you adopt your map on the 15th of December, the in lieu period is supposed to open on the 16th, but it's actually 28 days later. And then the number of signatures are compressed. So you have the elections office pressing for an earlier adoption so they don't have to make those adjustments. But that hasn't been changed.
And I would say it's great to see so many people attending today, because one of the thoughts is you're hearing a lot about this Glazer bill. This is certainly something where individual counties and RCRC and the School Board Association, everyone may want to consider kind of formulating a position and weighing in on additional changes that the Glazer bill may want to include.
I think I'll say that both RCRC and CSAC are both definitely engaged with that bill. We are very much aware about the importance that that issue and how that gets resolved and timing issues in general. Just to put in a plug, our lobbyists for both organizations are working on that very, very hard. So another interesting question. This deals with the requirement that the basically members of the public, may submit maps. Do you need to be a resident of a jurisdiction to submit a map? In other words, can someone from outside your county submit a map, and is the county required to accept it?
Yeah, the law doesn't have any sort of limitation on what constitutes a member of the public. Historically, in fact, outside groups are maybe the most likely to submit maps. You'd have organized advocacy groups come in and submit maps. So I think the answer is probably you do not have to be a resident, and the county should accept whatever comes its way.
Makes sense. So I've got a couple of technical questions that are probably well over my head, but certainly not well over Doug's. Doug, if the county election management systems are state certified, how would you suggest that counties automate their processes if we can't modify the software where voter and precinct data must be stored?
Oh, yeah, so it's a good question. So there's two pieces to this. The kind of executing the election once the precincts are drawn side, yeah, you're in the world of state certification and can't touch that. Where there is the opportunity to manage things is how those precincts get drawn. The GIS side of taking in all these maps and tagging each voter with which election area they're in each jurisdiction. So there are some counties already that are fantastic at this. Generally the really big counties, because they have so many large jurisdictions, they've had to automate this process or semi-automate it long ago. But now this is going to kind of impose that on the many more counties of getting swamped by this. So the state certified side, yeah, there's nothing you can do, certainly in the time available. Where there is the opportunity to improve the process is on the GIS side of creating those what become ballot groups and what become the precincts and how those are drawn on the GIS side, rather than manually going through doing one city at a time and moving the lines. There are ways that the software can help do that for all the jurisdictions at once.
Hang on, let me get the next one. So the next question concerns the basically the website requirements that we talked about. Our agenda management system keeps a lot of the records required. Could we include a link on the separate redistricting webpage that takes the user back to our agenda management page that contains all of the various records, video, public comment, staff reports, etc.? And do we think this will be sufficient to meet the requirement?
I think that's probably going to be okay. As long as it's located, it's available with a click. The best practice is to have it available on a click from your face page of your county website. Have a redistricting button. If that takes you to your agenda management system and everything is there and easily accessible, there's no limitation that it has to be separate from that. It can be maintained by the county or maintained on a server under the county's control. So if your agenda management system, which has agendas for all of the different county agencies on it, can handle the redistricting, yes, there's no prohibition about not doing it that way. I think the important part of that, though, is accessibility. Make sure that you can get there quickly and not have to go through board of supervisors and then to elections and then to agendas and then to redistricting. Have it right up there on the front page.
Let me ask one more process question, and then I know we've got about another 20 minutes, so I will jump to the questions on the kind of the substantive portions of redistricting. So on the process, is the map an official document, or do you still need to have a written description, meets and bounds, adopted into your code?
I mean, lots of jurisdictions do not do that anymore. There's no requirement that meets and bounds be used. Some jurisdictions still do it as a matter of historical practice, but it's not required. A lot of resolutions and ordinances simply refer to an exhibit, which is the map that it was adopted, and then that GIS map is provided to the registrar.
And just adding to that, we get the question a lot. And when the demographer provides a map, we also provide what's called a census block equivalency file, which is a list of every census block in the county and which district it's assigned to. And then online, the Census Bureau has a place where you can look up an address and it will tell you which census block that address is in. So if there ever was litigation about whether a candidate or a voter was in a given district or not, it's a simple matter. If you just punch their address into that census website, it gives you a block number and you go to that Excel file that's saved that lists which district that's in. So you don't need the meets and bounds to address that battle down the line if someone does end up in court for that.
So it's funny you should mention census blocks because we've actually gotten a couple of questions about that. But let me first start with one that start on the substance side with something that another thing that we had actually talked about during kind of our prep call, which I think is going to be much on people's minds, which is how do we deal, what role do existing districts play? If we start with existing districts and tweak them as necessary and document that those districts are compliant with the mandated criteria, is that okay? Or do we need to start from scratch and show how we march through the mandated and prioritized requirements? I know we had a good discussion about this when we talked. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on the record.
Well, I mean, I don't think that there's, and I'll let Marguerite and Doug give their thoughts. I don't think that there's any requirement that you just completely start with a blank slate.
Yeah.
Right. Because I think, there's a good argument to be made that the existing districts in most cases already sort of encompass the idea of communities of interest and neighborhoods and that sort of thing. And they may need to be changed. They may need to be tweaked. Testimony may require that. But I don't think there's an obligation to just throw the baby out with the bathwater and ignore those districts as they exist, because those voters have already been voting together for the past 10 years, right? They may have formed political communities based on sort of shared electoral goals. They may have common interests already as a result of testimony from prior decades. And so I don't think that they have to be completely wiped out. But the caveat is, given the new rules, I think you need to be more prepared than maybe some counties would have been in the past to make significant modifications if that's the direction that the testimony points.
And Chris, I agree with that. There's nothing that says you have to start over from a blank slate. And as Chris mentioned, your districts now likely took into account your population centers, whether they be towns or cities, et cetera. So a lot of the bones are there. But if you're just going to tinker around with them, use your public hearings to make a record supporting them. Once you get into court, somebody doesn't like the way your map comes out, the universe is your record. You can't make up something after the fact and say, look, this district respects this community of interest or needs to be shaped the way it was to promote a particular interest of importance to the county. If that's not in the record, the court's going to ignore it. So yes, your existing districts can be a starting point, but take time to painstakingly document why they are compliant with law under the new criteria, number one. And number two, as Chris said, you might find yourself faced with the need to make a change that you could have walked past 10 years ago.
And just a quick example of this, we worked with one jurisdiction where a neighborhood came in and said, it was a city, and they said, we really need to stay in council member X's district. because the biggest issue in our neighborhood is this liquor store that's the center of all crime and trouble. And it's a 12-year project to pull a liquor store permit. And so we've been through this now for 8 years. The council members' staff are now experts in this. And if we switch districts, we'd have to, it'd be a new issue for new council member whose staff would have to start from point one. So they tied it very clearly into an issue of legislative concern and made a record of why they needed to continue that effort. And obviously for a county, the number of issues you could use to make that case are huge. So you have a decent standing to just state the existing district as a community of interest, but you're much better off if you can tie it into issues that are shared amongst that district.
But be careful though, Doug, because you can't define your community of interest with respect to incumbents.
Right. Yeah, they were very careful that the community of interest
would not probably be permissible under the law. But
yeah, the community of interest issue would have to be the liquor store and tying those areas together, not the council member, definitely.
So that actually segues well, kind of particularly the bit about communities of interest not including incumbents or political parties, political candidates. This kind of goes along the same lines. In the past, board members requested results of some former elections, particularly state propositions, but not candidacy, as one measure of a community of interest as the mapping process got close to the end. Is consideration of voting results currently voting results like that allowed or not allowed?
I think there are circumstances in which it would be allowed, but I think you want to be really careful. For example, there may be certain ballot measures in particular that would help define a community of interest. I mean, I could see that being a legitimate use of election data in some cases. I think if you start looking at candidate elections, you're begging for trouble, honestly, given the way the statute is worded. It's hard to see how that would stand up. Ballot measures, I think, because they're issues and because they may define the social and economic considerations that would help identify communities of interest, that may be permissible.
And you may be looking at election data when it comes to your Voting Rights Act compliance. Remember that.
True.
There is going to be debate about the proper level for a Section 2 compliant district. As Chris said, it used to assumed that level was 65%. I can almost guarantee you that in California, a 65% minority eligible voter district would be challenged as packed. And that's because in California, there's a lot of crossover voting. And a minority district may not need to be at that level to provide an effective opportunity to elect chosen candidates. How do you determine that? You determine that through election analysis and racially polarized voting analysis of candidate elections. So there is the yin of what Chris, and I fully support that. Absent a Section 2 concern, I think it is dangerous to look at candidate voting patterns. But the yang of that is you may have to, in order to ensure and defend your Voting Rights Act compliance.
So the next question we've actually gotten a couple of questions, and I think as we talked about when we were preparing this presentation, small counties sometimes have unique challenges, and I think this is one that's probably more likely to apply to some of our smaller members. Can you split a census block? Is that permissible? Obviously, that's something in an urban jurisdiction you probably won't even be thinking about doing, but in a fairly small jurisdiction where, one census block has a fairly good percentage of your population, there may be some interest in doing that, particularly to preserve a community of interest. Is that doable legally, and is that doable technically, and what does that look like?
Yeah, doable legally, I'll let Doug, it's an ugly thing to have to do if you can avoid it, but I'll let him talk about the process.
Yeah, exactly. It's something we prefer to avoid, especially at the local level in the really small counties, because if it's a block that has a lot of people in it, it can move you from using official census data to, your demographers attempt to divide that census data between the two pieces. So when we do it, we strongly recommend it only be done to divide the populated part of a block from the zero population part of a block. For example, we run into this a lot with like train yards and things like that, where we'll use the unpopulated side as goes in a different district. But technically, it does introduce huge issues into the map because all the redistricting software packages start with a basis of blocks. It isn't impossible, but it does generate technical challenges. And if you're dividing a populated block into two pieces, you do introduce changes to the database that then could be challenged down the road.
And just to comment on that, to put a little finer point on it, everybody knows that the census is a guess, but it's a guess that the courts have accepted. And when you split a populated census block, you're looking at it with Google Earth to figure out where the houses are. And you're making an estimation at how many people are in each one of those houses. And so what you end up with is a potential inability to defend the equal population aspects of your district, because you can't really say whether those populations are really anywhere near what they ought to be to satisfy equal population based on the adjusted census data. Now, Doug will tell you it's technically possible to do, and I'll confess we've engaged in the practice. Sometimes it's required, but it is not anything we recommend.
So this next question, actually, I think came out of Butte County, but I think it applies to certainly a lot of the rural and even the urban counties. A lot of these counties have had substantial population shifts or population changes due to disasters. These are population changes that will hopefully be temporary. This specific one, concerns the town of Paradise, which completely burned down. But more generally, I'm sure this is happening in other areas of the state as well. How does this affect redistricting?
Well, in theory, those numbers should show up in the new census, right? Those changes, and now there's no population there, and so you're going to have to adjust that district to pick up that population from somewhere else. The really kind of squirrely cases may be the ones where that population shift has happened very, very recently, and it might not show up in the census. Like this past fall, where things were burning down. That's a little bit dicier, and it's a question how you deal with that. And given the way the statutes are worded, they require you to use the census data. And if the census data is wrong, that's hard to say exactly what you're supposed to do there.
Yeah, and a lot of it depends on well, Doug, go ahead.
Well, I was going to add that too. Historically, before this law kicked in saying you must use the state version of the census data, we have had jurisdictions where we did mid-decade population updates and got building permit data and demolition data and all that kind of stuff. And theoretically that might be the way you would make a case about a problem with the census data, but we only have 6 weeks. There's going to be 6 weeks from when you get the data to when you lose jurisdiction to a court. So none of that, there's no time for any of that kind of analysis, and really the state law saying you'll use the state's database kind of determines that, unfortunately.
Yeah, and it also depends on where people answered what they said on the census. So the fires happened before the census occurred. The census was on 1st of April, 2020. It was last year. And I'm so lost I guess we had some fires in 2020. Yeah. Which fires? But you went online, and if you moved out of Paradise, and you moved to your family home in Cincinnati, you were counted there. However, if you answered that your address was still in Butte County, the census is going to count you in Butte County. You're supposed to say where your permanent residence is. So a lot of the uncertainty is not what the population of these damaged communities used to be. It's where the people say they are now. You're supposed to be counted where you are. And we are not going to know that until hopefully the 25th of September.
And,
One thing I
it's
will
definitely
say,
not just, I was just gonna add, it's definitely not just a fire issue. We've got huge COVID issues too, in college towns
Yeah.
where all the dorms emptied out. So this is, and I know the UC system did a huge effort to reach the families and the college kids and say, respond with your college address. Because that was the census guidance. If you left because of the pandemic, that's a temporary leave and your address is still your college address. We won't know how successful that was at getting people to do that until we see the data. And there's very, very little room to do anything about it if there are issues, which there's sure to be some.
I mean, one thing you can do to take this into consideration, because the local community is going to know about these issues in some cases, is take advantage of that 10% deviation, right? You might purposely under or overpopulate a district because, yeah, the official numbers say that there's population there, but you know there really isn't. So you overpopulate it a little bit. So as a practical matter, it really is closer to ideal than it would otherwise be. You still have to stay within that official 10%, but you might push it those deviation a little further out from perfect than you might otherwise, to take those issues into account. That's one way to at least partially address it.
That segues well into another question that we got, which was, please talk a little bit about what substantially equal means in the context of Section 21500A. And let me preface this by noting that back when I was working with Tehama County on this back in 2011, we entitled our presentation as aiming for zero. The idea that 10% was an outer limit, but you should try to aim for a zero deviation and be able to explain, rationally why you had to deviate based on the other criteria. Maybe that's a little bit overly conservative, but if you could talk, particularly in light of your last comment, which I thought was very interesting, if you could talk a little bit about what substantially equal means in this context.
Yeah, I mean, this goes back to the conversation we had earlier about federal law. It's if you are within that 10% deviation, the courts will assume that is a legitimate map, right? And the burden to challenge that in that circumstance is very high. And so as long as the jurisdiction has sort of a plausible explanation for why it is the way it is and what considerations they took into account, the courts are going to be very deferential on that issue. The one case ever, I think, that has struck down a map under 10% was out of Georgia two election cycles ago. And the record was crystal clear that the legislature in drawing the state legislative map was overpopulating Republican districts and underpopulating Democratic ones to favor the Democratic majority that controlled that legislature. And the court said, look, I know you get 10%, this is 9.98, but doing it for these partisan reasons is not legitimate, but as long as you base it on the sort of criteria and sort of normal policy considerations that the courts have recognized as legitimate, you have that wiggle room, and it's very difficult to challenge.
And I must say, Art, I like your approach. Aim for zero, explain deviations. In other words, don't say we're going to aim for a 5% deviation. No, aim for zero, explain your changes. And I know some jurisdictions say in no instance greater than 1%, which is fine, but it's 0% with wiggle room to meet your other goals.
Okay, well, thank you very much. On that happy note, I see we have just about hit the noon hour. So let me say to the folks that have submitted questions, because there were more questions than we were able to get to, I will work with our panelists to get answers to those questions and email them back to you. If there are any questions that I inadvertently dismissed or deleted without you getting an answer due to my own technical non-proficiency, please do not hesitate to email us. We want to get answers back to you. So with that, let me thank our panelists very, very much. This has been fantastic. I've had people texting and emailing me their praise and general thankfulness for the information that you have provided. This has been, I've learned a lot. Definitely appreciated. And to our audience, thank you very, very much for attending. And let me also put a pitch out for the second webinar in our series, which is tentatively aimed for mid-April, which is going to focus more on the sort of the on-the-ground realities that our electeds and their senior staff are going to be dealing with, and some of the best practices for turning all of this information, legal and demographic, into something that is actually actionable on the ground by elected officials. So please stay tuned for that. Watch the barbed wire, watch the CSAC bulletin, and we will definitely be in touch. Thank you all very much and have a good afternoon.
Thank you all.
Thank you.